Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So, an idea that I floated recently on a Facebook page called HEMA Wild Theories, I'll post a link to that page below in case you have any interest in that page, is the idea that some of the fencing treatises out there, which in some cases inevitably some people study, and that's where it becomes controversial of course, I'll come back to that in a second, some of those treatises are potentially rubbish, okay? Not necessarily just rubbish because we don't agree with them, but that the person who wrote them wasn't actually really an authority in their own time. And it seems that some people kind of get quite abrasive over this suggestion. I think because we have a tendency to put historical people, particularly us HEMA people, have a tendency to put historical people on a pedestal. You know, they were alive at the time, they knew the real thing, they were doing the real deal, they knew what they were talking about. Well, is that true of other fields of art or science or mechanics or anything else? Well, no. Quite simply, yes, there were people in the past who knew, you know, exactly how the best way of treating a certain medical condition might be, and there were other people who had completely wacky ideas. Now, of course, fencing is a very different thing. It's a physical skill. So let's take it to something like a sport. Tennis, for example. There isn't only one style or only one method. There are people who play in different styles. So, you know, going back to sort of tennis players of when I was a teenager, Andre Agassi and Pete Sampras play in very, very different ways, or played in different ways. A very, very different style. And similarly, if we look at, you know, modern tennis players, some lean very heavily on very powerful serve and a very quick, or some might rely on a very quick return game, and others are happier closer up to the net and playing a volley game. Fencing is exactly like that in that there isn't only one way to skin a cat. So we have to start off when we're approaching this topic of saying that weapons themselves are different, contexts are different, so the way that you might be using that weapon, or the environment, the country, the laws, the type of warfare, the type of dueling, companion weapons, all sorts of other things might change the specifics of how you use a weapon. And additionally, on top of that, individuals will come up with different systems. So if we take something like rapier and dagger, for example, there isn't one optimal, perfect way of using the rapier and dagger in all fights. Remember that a fight might take many different scenarios. Even a duel might have different scenarios. You might sometimes be dueling to the death, sometimes to the first wound. You might be multiple opponents. You might be in a street. You might be in a room. You might be on different types of ground. You might have rapiers of different length. You might have daggers which have a form of handguard, or daggers which don't have much handguard, just have a crossbar. So many different minutiae of detail mean that the overall perspective of this question is that you get lots of different fencing systems for lots of different reasons, and simply because different people come to different conclusions. Based on their own personal anecdotal evidence and experience, you will come to different conclusions. So if we look at Fiore de Liberi's treatise, just one example, obviously the one that I know the best in the medieval world, but there are other examples which are similar. They start out saying something along the lines of, I've studied under many people, studied in lots of different places, under lots of different masters, and what I show in this book is what I consider to be best. This is my system. Well, every individual who travels around and studies with different people, fights different opponents, experiences different things, will come to slightly different conclusions. Now, that's not to say that, of course, some things aren't sort of universal truths and commonalities. So there are certain things that would be stupid to do with a longsword, and there are some things which generally most people do with a longsword. So if we look at any longsword system as an example, you will find similarities between them, but you'll also find differences. So there is a sort of percentage of common ground, and then there's a percentage of variable, which can vary depending on the weapon, the clothing, the country, the context of that environment, the warfare, the armor, all sorts of things, even the period and the external influences. So, very, very complex matter. But coming back to the original question, therefore, we can't assume that all people who wrote treatises on fencing were good necessarily. Okay, if we look at the modern world, if we look at the 20th century, for example, there are a lot of books written on sport fencing, and some of them are much better books than others. Now, there are two possible reasons for that. Someone can be a very good teacher and not necessarily a very good fencer. Someone can be a very good fencer and not a very good teacher. Sometimes people aren't very good at either, and sometimes people are good at both. And of course, it's not just a question of black or white, good or bad. There's a scale there as well. There's a spectrum. So someone could be a legendary fencer and only mediocre person at putting this down into a system and teaching other people how they do. In my life, I've experienced many people in HEMA actually, but also in sport fencing that I did before, archery, which I did for many years competitively. I've experienced many people who were just good at a thing, and they couldn't really explain, even to themselves, what it was they did that made them good. So that's one level, okay? One level is just because someone's good at a thing or has a demonstrable talent at a thing doesn't mean that they're any good at formulating a system that other people can benefit from, okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is that just because you can write a book doesn't mean you know anything. There are inevitably people throughout history who've written books who were complete BSers. They didn't really know what they were doing, or they were deliberately trying to defraud the reader. We know this in all fields of science and art and all forms of literature, that sometimes you get someone who's just a BSer. And you need a certain amount of knowledge to be able to see through that. And particularly in, let's say, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, there was a lot of fencing literature, really a lot. I mean, we have hundreds and hundreds of manuals from the 19th century on all sorts of things, from foil and small sword through military sabre, bayonet, boxing, wrestling, all sorts of stuff. You know, if you get, you know, Lacan, Grand Can, loads of stuff. We've got so much material from the 19th century. And it is of variable quality. Even within the narrow field that I mostly focus on, which is British military sabre, there are definitely some manuals which have more worth, not only as a book, but also as a system. And those are two different things. You can have a good system that's not represented by a good book, and you can have a really good book that's a kind of basic, not particularly special system, but it's a very good book for beginners, for example. And there are books that I would put into those categories as well. So I commonly refer to Broadsword and Single Stick by Allinson Wynne and Phillips Woolley. I think that is a great book for a beginner in British military sabre or single stick, kind of the same thing at that point, to pick up and read. I don't think it represents, it gives you very much of a system, very much of a complex system anyway, but it's brilliant, I think, as a first pick up, read, learn it, do what they say, and see where that leads you next. Waite, for example, is not a good beginner's book at all. So I mostly study John Musgrave Waite's book of 1880, Lessons in Sabre. So John Musgrave Waite's Lessons in Sabre from 1880, which is the main source that I study from and teach from, is a fantastic sort of slightly more advanced level book, but it's not a good beginner book at all. I wouldn't recommend a beginner to dive straight into Waite because it doesn't explain certain of the fundamental basics, because it assumes that you already know the basics of fencing. You know, simple things like how to lunge and the fact that every attack is made with a lunge and things like this, things that someone who's new to fencing or new to sabre fencing at least doesn't necessarily know. And I remember years ago, about 20 years ago, when I was focusing on medieval sources and I started reading some of the sabre sources, it wasn't evident to me at all that all of these sources make an attack with a lunge. Sometimes if you're coming into it from a different tradition and you're not taking something for granted, as it were, because someone coming from a 19th century British fencing background would just take that for granted, it's not necessarily patently obvious. But there is another element, and this is more of the element that I think is more interesting in a way. So we've got people who don't really know much about the topic, and deliberate people who are trolling essentially, or just writing rubbish. There's also different experiences and different worths of literary worth to the book and the system individually. But there's another element. There's another element, which is that very often we only have one book from an author. Okay, and we don't know, even if that person was a legendary swords person, we don't always know whether that book accurately represented their system, or whether it represented their system at its apex. So an example that I used on this sort of forum thread was that of Sir William Hope. So Sir William Hope lived in the late 17th century, and he wrote several treatises on the use primarily of the small sword. He does talk about other things as well, like the broadsword or backsword, the basket-hilted cut and thrust sword. But primarily he was focused on the small sword. Now what's interesting about Sir William Hope is he wrote several treatises. Now most fencing authors we know about, in fact most martial arts teachers we know about, from anywhere in the world, didn't write several books through the course of their development, evolution if you want to call it that, whereas Sir William Hope did. And from it we can see that to begin with he was doing essentially French small sword method, obviously quite competent, well written books, this kind of stuff, but at some point in his career he decided, you know what, I'm completely changing my ideas about what's good, what works, about the system that I want to leave as a legacy, and he created his new method. Now, I'm not an expert on Sir William Hope at all, and for anyone who wants to know more about Sir William Hope, I would point you to the Linacre School of Defence and Dr. Milo Thurston. So anyone who comes to fight camp, or in fact skirmish, various events that I've run over the years, you will know Milo. And Dr. Thurston is a very long time student. I think without a shadow of doubt, the world expert on Sir William Hope. I've been studying him for about 20 years, I think. And when you look at Hope's new method, it's very clearly a departure, a stark departure from what he was doing before. So if you looked at his earlier book, and if we only had his earlier book, we'd say, oh, Hope was doing this, blah, 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 it just looks like French small sword, maybe with a few quirks that are particular to him, but essentially he's doing French small sword. If you only had his later treatise, you'd look at it and go, well, it's completely different system, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but you've got that narrative because you've got several treatises throughout his career. You've got a narrative to be able to see how he developed. Now, what would be even better than that would be if we had treatises left by his students. So how did his system survive? What became of it? Where did it go from there? What was he doing at the end of his life, and what was he teaching his students, and how did they take it on? And that's the thing to remember as well, is that the systems are the product of individuals and schools. Okay, it's not always about evolution from bad to good. It doesn't work like that with martial arts or any sports or physical skills really. It's more about physical interpretation and system interpretation through time to suit the needs of that moment and what seems best to that person. It's a very complex, combat obviously is very, very complex, and therefore the solutions to it are going to be many, not few. What would be even better is if we had some stuff from his students, which as far as I know we don't. But if we come to another source, which I'm not going to name for now because it's going to be in a publication that I'm working on, I found a few months ago, an article written by one of the students of a treatise I have studied. And it's very, very interesting because what it does is it's talking about the same system, but in another person's words and perspective, which is wonderful, because so often when we're reading a book there are ambiguities from the text that leave us wondering, well, I think I know what he meant, but I'm like 90%, but 10% he could have meant this. And in this case, because you've got another perspective, you can triangulate on, okay, I now know exactly what that person was saying because his student says the same, is describing the same technique in a slightly different way, and it's completely clear now what it is. But in addition, that student also describes that teacher's system basically as it was at the end of their life and how it's developed beyond that, how it was taught to the students and what the students are doing with it now. And there were some changes, and that's even more interesting to me. This student has made a change to the master's system in one particular way that I'm aware of. So, coming back to the original point, which I think I've stayed relatively close to in this video, which is unusual for me, but by and large, we can't assume that just because a historical martial arts treatise, and I'm talking about European fencing here, but this could apply to Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, any other martial arts, okay? Just because someone wrote a treatise or a manual or a book, manuscript, about their system, first of all, it doesn't mean that that is an accurate representation of the system necessarily, although that's probably the only thing we've got to go on. Equally, it could be a very good book, doesn't mean it's a great system. It could be an amazing system, but not a very good book. And also, it doesn't necessarily represent the system as it kind of reached its apex and fully developed form. They may have written it at an earlier stage in their life and never got round to updating it and doing a sequel, as it were. And if we look at George Silver, I'm not going to get into, George Silver's a very contentious person to bring up in general in HEMA, but we have his Paradoxes on Defence, which is from about 1599, if I remember correctly. And then, like about 3-4 years later, about 1602 or 3, I think, he brought out Brief Instructions upon my Paradoxes of Defence. It's essentially the sequel. And that book, and many people consider that book more useful than the first one. And at the very least, it's a user guide. It explains a lot of stuff that wasn't clear in the first book. If you didn't have that second book, then the first book would be a lot less useful than it is. So there we go. Studying treatises is a minefield. It's very, very complicated, but we also shouldn't put historical people on pedestals unnecessarily and just assume that because they were around then, they were alive at the time, and they wrote a book, that they therefore knew what they were talking about. There are treatises out there which many people consider to be inferior, both in terms of the book and in terms of the system represented in there. And I have to say, some people who wrote books were complete BSers. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that's been interesting, and I will see you again for a new video really, really soon. Happy New Year! Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.